Mena-Watch, the independent Middle East think tank. In the second part of our conversation with Professor Stephan Grigat, we will now delve into the historical classification of the so-called Middle East conflict and also explore the critical questions surrounding anti-Semitism in Germany, across Europe, and indeed throughout the entire world. Did the so-called Middle East conflict, which until now has really only involved the ongoing conflict between Israel and the Palestinians, truly begin only with Israel's founding?
No, absolutely not. Nevertheless, you very frequently read and hear this exact assessment, especially in the German-language Middle East discourse, don't you? This very notion consistently resurfaces, not only within academic circles, articulated by some of my esteemed colleagues, but is also widely disseminated in journalistic narratives and everyday discussions. The prevalent notion is that prior to 1948, up until the establishment of Israel, Jews and Muslims, and more broadly Jews and Arabs, coexisted in a relatively peaceful manner within this region. Subsequently, with the foundation of Israel, the conflict either erupted dramatically or indeed originated at that very point. And ever since then, there's supposedly been this issue of anti-Semitism brewing in the Arab world, which completely and falsely implies that this very anti-Semitism within Arab and Islamic-influenced societies somehow manifested as an immediate, direct reaction solely to the establishment of the State of Israel. This is an extremely prevalent narrative, and in my estimation, it's fundamentally flawed and to some extent quite perilous. It casts such a profoundly distorted, indeed utterly false light on this so-called conflict in the Middle East that it truly necessitates a more comprehensive and foundational discussion. If that assumption were accurate, then this widespread anti-Semitism in the Arab and Islamic world shouldn't have been present before 1948. And from a historical standpoint, that is simply utter nonsense. In the Arab and Islamic-influenced world, there exists, for one, a discernible tradition of Islamic Jew hatred, which undeniably emanates from particular schools of thought and specific interpretations within the broader Islamic framework. While it was indeed less severe than the Christian hatred of Jews, the anti-Judaism prevalent in Europe, it certainly was still a very real and present issue. When I say it was less severe, what I mean is that for many centuries, Jews, both men and women, actually fled from Christian territories, seeking refuge in those under Islamic rule, not because they had it good there, but rather because things were less terrible for them. That's how it truly must be phrased. And the problem emerged in the 20th century when this conflict between the Zionist movement and the Arab national movement, which is indeed how it should actually be characterized, arose and subsequently gained considerable momentum. However, something else is also taking place. This Islamically influenced animosity toward Jews, which is largely predicated on their disdain within traditionally Islamic and Arab societies, is not the only factor at play. Rather, just as Christian anti-Judaism in Europe escalated into modern racist anti-Semitism, this traditional form of hatred also undergoes a similar radicalization. Islamic Jew hatred radicalizes into the anti-Semitism we know from modern political Islam. And this is a development that becomes relevant at roughly the same time. It becomes relevant as fascism and National Socialism rise to prominence in Europe. I briefly mentioned it earlier. The founding of the Muslim Brotherhood in 1928, exactly 2 decades before the establishment of the State of Israel, marks a pivotal and central date in this timeline. Because the Muslim Brotherhood, led by Hassan al-Banna at that time, was openly anti-Semitic right from its inception without any question. So, not merely anti-Zionist or anti-Israel, as Israel didn't even exist then, but rather overtly anti-Semitic. And the Muslim Brotherhood, my colleague Matthias Künzel, among others, has articulated this with remarkable precision. In my opinion, their anti-Semitism is characterized by its unique synthesis of 2 traditions: the historically rooted Islamic animosity toward Jews, which was largely based on disdain, and the modern conspiratorial, myth-driven anti-Semitism that was more commonly observed in Europe. This is all thrown together, so to speak, which leads to an extremely contradictory worldview, but for anti-Semitism, that's really not a problem. Anti-Semitism always paints a completely contradictory picture of reality, but these contradictions are then ultimately resolved or attempted to be resolved through violence and the persecution of Jews. Within the British Mandate of Palestine, where the real conflict then ignited between the Zionist and Arab movements, we can already observe a significant figure such as Amin al-Husseini, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, emerging as early as the 1920s. And it is crucial for understanding why it is incorrect to assert that anti-Semitism in this conflict solely originated with the establishment of Israel. No, this anti-Semitism played a decisive role even 20 years earlier. When discussing the Mufti, it's crucial not to paint a homogeneous picture of Arab society, especially since at that time he was not a particularly important political figure on the Arab-Palestinian side initially. So, in the early 1920s, even as some of the Mufti's followers engaged in pogrom-like violence against Jews residing in Mandate Palestine, the majority of the Arab-Palestinian populace actually stood in opposition to the Mufti's agenda. They didn't want such radical positions. That's a crucial point, especially for the current discussions surrounding Arab-Israeli rapprochement. It's always crucially important to highlight this. During the 1920s, there were indeed segments within Arab society that responded with a relatively cooperative stance towards Zionism, a fact often overlooked. And there was also concrete cooperation, meaning it wasn't just Amin al-Husseini's extended family, the Husseinis. For instance, there were also the Nashashibis, and from that family emerged much more moderate voices, more moderate forces, who, in certain instances, even advocated for cooperation with the Zionists, stating, yes, why not? These are well-educated individuals who are coming here. Let's see. Perhaps we can collectively establish something. Then, without going into excessive detail, 36 to 39. From 1936 to 1939, the Great Arab Revolt occurred. Before that, there were even worse pogroms. In Hebron in 1929, the Mufti's followers killed anti-Zionist Jews, you see. That immediately indicates that it's not solely about Zionism, it's genuinely targeting Jews. Even then, the Mufti was just one Palestinian Arab politician among others, and there remained significant alternative powers. During the Great Arab Revolt from 1936 to 1939, the Mufti became utterly dominant on the Arab-Palestinian side, which then had fatal repercussions for the subsequent history of the conflict. If that hadn't happened, some form of cooperation would almost certainly have been found. The UN partition plan of 47 would probably have been accepted, and for 80 years there would have been an Israeli state and a Palestinian state right next to it, and then we would have seen how. While it wouldn't have been all peace and harmony, it surely would have been far less bloody than it was. But things turned out differently. From 36 to 39, this revolt by the Mufti's followers was directed against the British. That could have been common ground with the Zionists, it could even have been a basis for cooperation. It targets Jews, specifically not just Zionists, but explicitly against the Jews who live there. Hundreds of Jews were slaughtered, and more significantly, it was primarily aimed at the moderate Arab-Palestinian factions. In this uprising, more moderate Arabs were brutally murdered by the Mufti's followers than the Jews were by them. This means that through murder and bloodshed, the Mufti Amin al-Husseini positioned himself at the very forefront of the Arab nationalist movement. This also showed institutionally there was the High Arab Committee back then. That was essentially the institutional representation of the Arab population. The Mufti became the head of this High Arab Committee. Therefore, he was not, as some, shall we say, less than thoroughly informed colleagues still assert to this very day, a mere marginal figure in the grand tapestry of Palestinian history. He went on to become the pivotal and central figure in Arab-Palestinian history. This also applies to his cooperation with the Nazis, which is also of central importance for the future of the conflict. So, in 1939, the revolt was crushed by the British. The British, as a colonial power, did this with quite brutal force. The Mufti was compelled to escape, initially heading to Iraq, a place where, at that time, a pro-German coup had already occurred. Fortunately for many, that decision was overturned by the British, and the Mufti then sought refuge in Berlin. And he spent the next several years there, not simply just, he was furnished with a lovely villa by the Nazis in Berlin-Zehlendorf, specifically on Goethestrasse, if my memory serves me correctly. But he didn't just live comfortably there, which he easily could have on Goethestrasse in Zehlendorf. He was very active. Thus, from late 1940, specifically from 1941 to 45, the Mufti resided in Berlin, and during that period he certainly wasn't an insignificant or irrelevant Arab-Palestinian politician by any means. He was the leader of the Arab-Palestinian national movement at that time because he had asserted his dominance, because he had eliminated the other forces. During this time, he did all sorts of things. I just want to mention 3 points that are important for later. He was directly involved in the Nazi extermination policy targeting Jews and Jewish people. He meets, There's a famous photograph of him with Hitler, but there are countless other less familiar pictures where he's with high-ranking officials of the Nazi state, including those directing the Nazi extermination policy against European Jews. He inspected concentration camps. He essentially declared the Nazi actions against the Jews to be exemplary, stating, "That's precisely what we need." Furthermore, he frequently and directly intervened in political matters, including their extermination policies. Thus, we are aware of several truly documented and verified instances where he, regrettably, successfully campaigned against the emigration of Jewish children's transports to Palestine. He actively worked to prevent these children from finding refuge there. You see, the Nazis sometimes operated with this logic. We'll conquer the entire world later, so we can also eliminate the Jews in Palestine at a later time. Sometimes, for substantial payments, they agreed to allow Jewish children primarily to emigrate to Palestine and occasionally to England. In one instance, Amin al-Husseini became aware of this and promptly intervened with his cronies, specifically the state leadership and high-ranking Nazi officials, emphatically declaring, "This absolutely cannot be allowed to happen. We already have enough of these Jews in Palestine. We don't want them. They must be, what's the alternative, to be deported." And that's what happened. This case involves a Jewish child transport of over 1,000 children. It was not sent to Palestine. Instead, it was tragically rerouted to Auschwitz-Birkenau. And without exception, all of these children were murdered in Auschwitz-Birkenau, at the instigation of the Mufti, the leader of the Arab-Palestinian national movement at the time. It is crucial to repeatedly state this with utmost clarity. Secondly, Amin al-Husseini played a part in the establishment of Muslim SS divisions. In Bosnia, the SS division Handschar, for example. People also forget that today, the SS was not a purely German affair. You'd probably say today it was a multicultural force, right? So, in all territories cooperating with or occupied by Germany, SS divisions were generally formed, including Muslim SS divisions. And thirdly, and this is probably the most significant point for the post-45 period, the Mufti was involved, actively participating in the Nazi propaganda efforts for the Middle East region. I mean, the Nazis didn't just want to conquer the world, they also wanted to convince the whole world of their ideology, which is fundamentally an ideology of exterminationist anti-Semitism. And they transported this specific anti-Semitism into the region. They founded their own radio station, Radio Berlin. Sometimes in literature you'll see Radio Ziesen, because Radio Berlin was in Ziesen, which is a bit south of Berlin. Considering the era, it was a highly advanced radio station. Programs were produced there in Turkish, in Persian, also known as Farsi, and most significantly in Arabic. For a long time, Amin al-Husseini was the main person responsible for these Arabic language programs. He authored the scripts, which were instrumental in disseminating the ideology of Nazi anti-Semitism into the Middle East, a factor that undeniably had lasting repercussions for the post-1945 era. The Mufti's role was quite well known at the time. The Allies fighting against Nazi Germany knew exactly who he was, and he should have been charged as a war criminal afterwards, which would have been very good. Then many more people would know him today. Yugoslavia demanded his extradition. If you recall the SS division in Bosnia, so they had good reasons for that. But that didn't happen. The Mufti returned to the Middle East region and once again placed himself at the head of the Arab-Palestinian national movement. He once more assumed the chairmanship of the High Arab Committee. And against that backdrop, it's really no wonder that in 1947 the UN partition plan was ultimately rejected by the Arab side, as they were very much influenced by the Mufti and themselves held a remarkably similar ideology, meaning the Arab rulers of that time. In 1948, during the Israeli War of Independence, or to phrase it more neutrally, the initial Arab-Israeli war which erupted right after the state's establishment, the Mufti served, formally at least, as the supreme commander of the Palestinian combatants. These fighters engaged alongside the attacking Arab armies, who immediately launched an assault on the newly formed State of Israel. What's crucial for grasping the mindset of the Israeli combatants is that they were aware they were fighting, among other adversaries, against someone who, only a few years prior, had facilitated the transportation of Jewish children to Auschwitz-Birkenau. Yes, indeed, that really should be done. It's an integral part of contextualizing not only the war itself, but also the very significant movements of flight and expulsion that took place on the Palestinian side, particularly as the war was reaching its conclusion.
It's the case that since the founding of the state, Russia's policy, and I will now focus on Russia, has undergone a complete transformation. Up until that point, and when the establishment of the State of Israel was to be decided, Russia had vocally supported Israel's creation. However, that policy then shifted significantly, transforming into an anti-Zionist state doctrine. What were the underlying causes or reasons behind such a profound change?
Yes, that's correct. For the 2 decades leading up to the establishment of the Israeli state, a period during which the Soviet Union provided considerable, even massive support to the Soviet Union, along with its allied nations and various movements, including the Communist Party of Palestine, Israel, maintained an unequivocally and radically anti-Zionist stance, actively opposing it. They wholeheartedly rejected Zionism, they incited against it, and in a manner that could undeniably be characterized as anti-Semitic. And that only truly began to shift and change after the conclusion of the Second World War. But we can go into more detail when talking about Soviet anti-Zionism and its history. There are some terrible stories there. I'd love to delve deeper into how, at first, they were actually against fighting Nazi Germany at all, and how the Palestinian and Israeli communists even defended the Hitler-Stalin Pact, and all sorts of other wild, crazy stuff like that. However, regarding the narrative arc you just brought up, it's crucial to first understand that for 2 full decades, the Soviet Union and the Communist International, specifically its executive committee, maintained a staunchly anti-Zionist stance. There was a really sharp U-turn right after the Second World War. That's when we have the famous speech by Andrei Gromyko, who later became the long-serving foreign minister of the Soviet Union and was, at the time, the Soviet ambassador to the UN. He delivers a speech where he elaborates on why the Soviet Union supports the establishment of a Jewish state in the Mandate of Palestine. You can still listen to it today. It sounds as if a mixture of Theodor Herzl and David Ben-Gurion had written it. Well, that actually sounds like an almost passionate, very Zionist plea, don't you think? Furthermore, it is repeatedly acknowledged that we all failed the Jews. This is a profound recognition of the collective failure that when anti-Semitism escalated into the horrific genocidal policy of the Shoah, ultimately very few people truly cared or took active measures to confront it. This demonstrates a deep-seated societal neglect in the face of escalating atrocity. Acted actively against it, but rather it was a sort of side effect that this extermination machine was finally halted. All of that is addressed in this speech, and it serves to justify, so we are now supporting this. I think we must soberly acknowledge that it wasn't as if the Soviet leadership suddenly understood and accepted Zionism's core principles, and accepted the reasoning of Zionism, then said, okay, now we actually think this is right. Instead, it was simply based on typical interests, as is always the case with nations. There were predominantly 2 key reasons. Firstly, their aim was to undermine British imperialism, as it was frequently referred to in Soviet discourse. And it was understood that if a Jewish state was established there, it would signify a weakening of the British colonial power in that region, which after all held the mandate. So that was considered a favorable outcome. The second point is the political balance of power on the Israeli side and on the Arab side. The Arab states that were against it at that time were not yet the pseudo-socialist republican states like those under Gamal Abdel Nasser's pan-Arabism. Instead, they were mostly monarchies. Take King Farouk in Egypt, for example, a monarchy that Soviet rhetoric would have branded as reactionary and backward. They weren't interested in collaborating with them. On the other hand, the Zionist movement of that era was distinctly left-leaning, not aligned with Soviet communism. However, both before the state's establishment and for the initial 3 decades following its creation, the prevailing powers were social democratic and left socialist movements, weren't they? So, the government we see in Israel today, those parties existed as the opposition back then, but they literally had absolutely no say in anything. And it stayed that way for almost 30 years. So the Soviet Union assumed that if a Jewish state was established there, it wouldn't merely serve to diminish British influence, but would also emerge as a state that would steadfastly refuse to align itself with Western imperialism. Instead, the thinking was it would become something akin to an anti-fascist democratic buffer state, as the Soviets would term it. So, similar to what the Soviet Union originally intended for Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, and so on before bringing them into line, that was also the idea here. They don't have to become Soviet republics, but just left-leaning anti-fascist democratic states. So they hoped it would be like that in Israel. That's why they backed the state's founding. Thankfully, and what's more, they supported it even more than the United States did. That's something we need to understand. In 1948, both the US and the Soviet Union, victorious in World War II, backed the partition and the state's founding. The US then said, after the state's founding led to a war of aggression by the Arab states, you must defend yourselves. So there were no significant arms shipments from the US at all. But there were indeed arms shipments, life-saving arms shipments from Czechoslovakia with the support of the Soviet Union. That was war decisive in 1948. Without those provisions, they probably couldn't have defended the state back then. So just a few years later, a major shift occurred. And that had to do, among other things, with the specific point I just touched upon. Significant changes were definitely occurring on the Arab side. All of a sudden it wasn't, or rather not suddenly, but as a result of a prolonged development, it was no longer King Farouk reigning in Egypt, but initially Naguib, a figure completely forgotten by history today. And then Gamal Abdel Nasser very quickly ascended to power. And that was not, in the Soviet lexicon, a regressive monarchy, but rather a progressive people's democracy. And then Pan-Arabism emerged, which was comparatively secular in its orientation. And so, common ground was found. This marked the backdrop for the profound shift in Soviet foreign policy, starting in the early 1950s, which became fundamentally anti-Israeli and pro-Arab, influenced by the ongoing developments within these Arab nations. And it stayed that way until the collapse of the Soviet Union. Thus, for the subsequent decades, it was the Soviet Union and its satellite states, including East Germany, the GDR, that actively supported Israel's adversaries not solely on political and ideological fronts, but also through tangible, material, and military means. Thus, especially when discussing left-wing anti-Semitism and anti-Israel sentiment, I continually underscore this point. So it's important to talk about the new left and the 68ers here in Germany, and they were a big problem. Involvement came from parts of the so-called armed groups, meaning the terrorist groups RAF, 2nd of June Movement, June 2nd Movement, Revolutionary Cells. They closely collaborated with Palestinian terrorists. All of that plays an important role. A much more important role when it really comes to Israel's existence is the military build-up of Syria and Egypt by the Soviet Union. That was already the case in 1967, but it becomes clearest in 1973 during the Yom Kippur War, the war of aggression by the Arab states against Israel, which was extremely threatening for Israel, where at times it looked as if Israel would lose this war. This war would simply not have been possible if the Soviet Union and the GDR hadn't rearmed Syria and Egypt after '67, equipping them to the extent that they were actually capable of launching such a war of aggression. In 1973, there were even Soviet fighter pilots directly involved in attacks. There are legendary accounts of how the Israeli pilots suddenly said, "They're speaking Russian," and it was clear they were MiG jets, but then they realized some were flown by Russian pilots. There were even German soldiers already stationed in Syria, NVA soldiers from the East German army. They were also intended for deployment. There's a very interesting documentary from ARD, if I recall correctly, where some of these pilots are interviewed, and they explicitly state they were immensely relieved they weren't sent into action because they clearly understood the true nature of that situation. Yes, that they, as German soldiers, regardless of whether they were from East or West Germany, were supposed to wage war against the Jewish state mere decades after Auschwitz. For various reasons, they ultimately never saw active service. However, they had already been deployed to Syria to participate in the conflict. But once again, this substantial military backing from the Soviet Union, directly aiding Israel's sworn enemies, historically played a profoundly significant role in shaping events. And that only truly changes with the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union. With that, it disappears. By the way, Yitzhak Rabin also understood that with great foresight at the time. He saw a window of opportunity also for peace negotiations because he said, Russia, as a pro-Arab actor, is now gone. And it won't stay that way, he said. So he basically foresaw what we later saw in Syria. He said, right now there's chaos in Russia. They're neutralized as a global political player and thus also as a pro-Arab player, so they're out. But it won't stay that way. Once they've consolidated, they will immediately re-emerge as pro-Arab actors. And that's exactly what we've seen now with the military support, especially for Assad.
To expand upon this topic a bit further, it's worth noting that this pervasive anti-Semitism, manifesting in various forms, had predominantly been observed in Western European and Arab regions until recently. Since October 7, 2023, it has unfortunately spread to an extreme degree. So, we are now experiencing anti-Semitic incidents across the entire world. I don't know just how significant they are for each respective region. There's something in New Zealand, there's something in also in Indonesia, yes? So, how did this come to be? Has this anti-Semitism always existed there, or did it truly emerge just now through propaganda and deliberate influence peddling?
I mean, I think since October 7th, 2023, it's just become much more profoundly perceived here because we're having this critical discussion about the globalization of anti-Semitism. However, that really started significantly earlier.
Even in Asian countries where you wouldn't think there are any traditions of it.
Oh, yes, there are. Sadly, yes. Yes, very diverse traditions, of course, because we are talking about an extremely vast area. Even if you're just talking about Southeast Asia, that's still a vast region with an incredible number of people. But yes, unfortunately, even there are massive anti-Semitic traditions for various reasons, tragically so. So you do have areas that are not particularly strongly influenced by either Christianity or Islam. But of course, you also have regions where Christianity plays a crucial role. And with that, Christian anti-Semitism, that is to say Christian anti-Judaism, has also truly found its way and established itself there. There are those countries heavily influenced by Islam where the Islamic traditions of anti-Semitism play a truly decisive role. And then in other regions, in Japan, for instance, there exists a somewhat peculiar tradition, which I would characterize as anti-Semitic philosemitism. This is a noticeable aspect of their culture. So you can often buy Mein Kampf and Protocols of Zion at the newsstands. And in the everyday Japanese understanding, it's frequently perceived as something like, yes, this serves as a positive illustration. It says how the Jews rule the whole world. We want that too. It says the Jews can make a lot of money. We aspire to the same. We delve into it to learn. It's not even held against the Jews that it is so. They take this absurd assertion that they would rule the world, but they apply it positively, saying, yes, we can learn from that. We also desire that, so it's a known quantity. Moreover, in Japan, when it comes to the left, they are significantly instrumental in championing a tradition that is not at all philo-Semitic, but rather profoundly anti-Semitic. This even goes as far as the horrific terrorist attacks that have been carried out in Israel. The Japanese Red Army played a really crucial and significant role. For instance, one of the most heinous terrorist attacks that occurred in Lod, the principal culprits involved were members of the Japanese Red Army. So there are these leftist traditions, I wouldn't even call them just radical, but truly extreme, stemming from this rigid, authoritarian, Marxist-Leninist ideology that have really propelled this forward. And then there's Latin America, where currently things are quite virulent, with really intense, not just anti-Semitic, but anti-Semitic expressions across almost all political spectrums, unfortunately especially strong. On the left, there is a very deep-rooted, long-standing tradition. So this unfortunately forms a part of the still inadequately explored history of anti-Semitism within the left-wing movements. Virtually all of these left-wing guerrilla movements, which played a really significant role in the 70s and 80s, or even the left-leaning regimes that came into being as a result. In Nicaragua, for example, anti-Semitic anti-Zionism plays a considerably central and very significant role. So that's not new either. We could go on and on, also in many African countries, and South Africa, of course, India. So what I'm trying to convey is that this globalization of an anti-Semitic sentiment actually took place much earlier than often perceived. But yes, it's true that since October 7th, this issue has been perceived much more acutely here, perhaps because people recognize many shared aspects, or quite simply, I'm not sure, but undoubtedly, it's also generally related to the fact that with the internet, social media, and similar platforms, individuals now possess a far more globalized perspective. One doesn't have to be an expert in such matters to perceive that quite drastic events are also unfolding elsewhere in the world.
Let's do a little promotional spot now. You've also written a book about this called From Anti-Judaism to Hatred of Israel. So do you examine all the many possible manifestations of anti-Semitism? I would say that you can also search for it on the internet, but you can also get a copy. Can you briefly say something about that?
Yes, so practically everything we've touched upon up to this point is addressed within this very book. This is because it serves as a comprehensive compilation of texts alongside various interviews both featuring and conducted by me. So specifically, the anti-Semitism of the Iranian regime. The articles in the book delve into various topics, including the religious tradition of anti-Judaism, the history and precursors of the so-called Middle East conflict. However, a significant portion, and indeed a primary focus, is dedicated to the tradition of left-wing anti-Semitism, as well as the left's nuanced and diverse discussions surrounding Israel and Zionism, and indeed you can certainly acquire it for purchase. However, the excellent aspect of this book is that it was also released by Barbara Budrich Publishers just last month, in May of 2025. It's also available for free. That means it's available as an open access download on the publisher's website. There you can read in more detail about many things we can only touch on here.
Then, let's revisit the question of academic anti-Semitism, which I would suggest has only recently emerged into prominence. Perhaps you might not entirely agree with me, but the academic anti-Semitism that's so prominently emerging today in the protests that are occurring both in and around universities today, well, they frequently exhibit a notably uniform structural pattern. There are always these sayings such as "Free Palestine," but I've honestly never understood what Palestine is actually supposed to be freed from in the first place. And then the slogan "From the river to the sea" was chanted, and what really stood out at Columbia University in America were the strikingly identical tents that had been erected. So in some way, this does appear to be a rather concerted effort. In Iran, which can be seen in a certain respect as the progenitor of this entire ideology, people are capable of comprehending that they should not be walking over the Israeli flag. But here in Germany, at the universities, a type of academic resistance, post-colonialism, and a peculiar deviation from fundamental democratic principles are being taught and promoted. And what's more, these very actions are being defended by university administrations, ironically, under the guise of protecting free speech. So after all that, my questions are, first, so where does this entire movement, this whole direction within the academic sphere truly originate from? Scene comes from, and what kind of impact is it actually having on our democracy, truly?
Just a few quick preliminary remarks. Academic anti-Semitism itself, as a concept, is certainly not new. In fact, during the National Socialist era, anti-Semitism was particularly strongly expressed among academics. The whole tradition of student fraternities, especially the dueling German nationalist ethnic fraternities, is actually a core part of the modern anti-Semitic movement. Well, this is quite different now. These are individuals who perceive themselves as left-leaning, progressive, forward-thinking, and so much more, and who would unequivocally never aspire to be Nazis. However, just concerning that, as the term academic anti-Semitism is currently a much debated topic, there's absolutely nothing new about it. We simply have to acknowledge that fact. On the contrary, for many years, they were actually the pioneers who championed these very ideas, wouldn't you say? So the proportion of lawyers and doctors and such, especially within the NSDAP, was exorbitant. It was a very strongly pronounced phenomenon. But of course, this is a different situation now, because the theoretical references and backgrounds are quite different. A second preliminary remark is that, thankfully, not all university administrations simply disregard this, considering it freedom of speech. There are indeed very different positions not only between countries, but also within Germany itself. There have indeed been numerous cases, particularly right here in Berlin, where a scandalous hesitation from the university leadership was evident in taking decisive action against this. And here we're talking about extremely serious property damage, physical assault, threats, and a host of other things. There are other examples. At my university, the chancellor hung an Israeli flag from the window after October 7th. So he sent a very clear signal with that action and subsequently acted accordingly within the university's framework. And naturally, there are similar instances at other universities as well. But getting to the real question, what's new or relatively new, not new, since October 7th? However, what is new or relatively new, not just since October 7th, but looking at it across several decades, is the overwhelming triumph of certain theories that self-identify as left-leaning within the academic discourse. This shift marks a significant development in the intellectual landscape. It has always been the case on the left that you have different variations. There were people, even in earlier times, who adhered to certain theories, particularly those authoritarian Marxist-Leninist groups, factions, parties, and organizations that consistently argued in an anti-Semitic manner, mirroring the Soviet anti-Zionism of their time. I would argue that this was predominantly the case for the anti-Israel, anti-Semitic segment of the left, extending right into the 90s. Then the Eastern Bloc collapsed, and even now you still have these remnants of Marxism-Leninism who parade once a year at the Luxembourg-Liebknecht demonstration. But historically speaking, that's really not as relevant anymore. Yet throughout history, there have always been individuals who identify as left-wing and have actively challenged such perspectives. And I think that's also important to see. So it's not about somehow saying the left is anti-Semitic or something, but that this has always been a point of contention within the left. One could indeed discuss the proportions of the majority, but there has always been a tradition, which I myself am part of individuals who drew more upon critical theory, citing authors such as Adorno, Horkheimer, Marcuse and others, and naturally also Marx, but interpreting him in the proper sense rather than in the manner of the Marxist-Leninists. People like Jean Emery, who also originated from the left and was an early critic of left-wing anti-Semitism, approached this issue from a leftist perspective, employing leftist theory to critique this very left-wing anti-Semitism. And I'd say that's still very much the case today. What's new is that hardly anyone truly refers to Marxism-Leninism anymore to legitimize their animosity towards Israel. However, there is also a certain notable revival of truly authoritarian Marxist-Leninist groups emerging at universities these days. However, the more decisive influences are post-structuralist and postmodern theories, along with certain manifestations of post-colonialism. These theories provide the intellectual underpinnings for the current so-called protest movements, particularly the supposedly pro-Palestinian ones, which, when viewed objectively, are unequivocally pro-Hamas rallies. And in this regard, there are indeed significant national differentiations to be considered. So you've now mentioned a number of slogans that are actually quite prevalent across the globe. Ultimately, these always lead to the destruction and annihilation of Israel. This, from the river to the sea, of course, means exactly that. And yes, this Free Palestine, sure, if it were intended to be truly leftist and emancipatory, it would have to be phrased as Free Palestine from Hamas or Free Gaza from Hamas, but naturally such individuals never articulate it in that manner. In Germany, there's a unique characteristic regarding German history and the ongoing discussion. Slogans have suddenly emerged that are relatively new and unprecedented. Free Palestine from German guilt, for example, right? Or, and this is truly chilling, it sends shivers down my spine when I hear something like, Palestine will set us free, you know? Palestine will set us free. So if a leftist doesn't realize the historical tradition that such phrases belong to, then frankly, one truly reaches the absolute limits of criticism and any attempts at clarification. One is simply left in utter astonishment, trying to analytically grasp and categorize this phenomenon it represents a form of. It's criticism of the guilt culture typical of the AfD, yet framed in leftist terms. Ultimately, it's about this. In another book that I co-authored and edited with various colleagues, we directly address and refer to what we've termed the Historians' Dispute 2.0. This ties into recent historical political debates concerning the Nazi past. Yet, in contrast to the initial so-called historians' dispute of the 1980s, it's no longer the political right questioning the Shoah's unprecedented nature, but individuals on the left, and they are suddenly seizing upon this theme of German guilt in an entirely new and unexpected fashion, which ultimately seeks to challenge the unprecedented nature of National Socialism and the Shoah, and most importantly, it attempts to undermine the pro-Zionist implications derived from any comprehensive examination of National Socialism and its historical context. That's what's meant by Free Palestine from German guilt, right?
Yes, the issue with post-colonialism is that Jews are suddenly categorized as white individuals and colonizers, which, when considering the true nature of colonialism, can be an entirely inaccurate and misleading classification.
Exactly. With these phrases, both the accusation against Israel of being a colonial state, as well as one of white settler colonialism. These formulations, especially as a professor, make one despair a bit. It primarily reveals complete ignorance of the history of colonialism and anti-colonialism, and this Hahn-Whiten framing, within the so-called critical whiteness theory, or certain variations of it, one must say. There are different currents there too. Framing Jews, and especially Israelis, as white demonstrates a complete and utter lack of understanding of Israeli society. Allow me to elaborate, albeit succinctly, on both of these crucial points. The establishment of the State of Israel was undeniably, and rather significantly, an anti-colonial act. Wouldn't you agree? The founding of Israel meant, and I brought this up earlier, in connection with why the Soviets actually supported this state's establishment, it also meant that the British, as a colonial power, were forced out of the region. So in that sense, and also in certain self-perceptions of Zionism, both on the left and the very far right, yes, from the so-called Stern Gang, it was an anti-colonialist act. We're kicking the Brits out. This was also precisely how the anti-colonial forces of that era saw it. During the 50s and 60s, even when Golda Meir was serving as the foreign minister, there were incredibly close ties established between the newly founded post-colonial state of Israel and the recently decolonized nations across Africa, such as Ghana, for instance. Wouldn't you agree? And that made sense because they saw what the Israelis, what the Jews in Israel had achieved as a model. As I said, they also wished to expel the British. Furthermore, they desired a new, modern and democratic society advocating for equal rights for men and women, which was certainly not something to be taken for granted in those times, and to apply new agricultural methods and so on. That's precisely why I want it from Israeli agricultural advisors within these newly decolonized nations. This alliance truly only starts to fracture in 1967. That's when it sustains a significant, noticeable blow. And especially in 1973, this wasn't really because of the true nature of anti-colonialism, but rather due to significant pressure from the Arab states. They essentially blackmailed the African states by declaring, "We possess the oil and natural gas. If you don't break off your relations with Israel now, who is our mortal enemy, then you won't get it anymore." There are truly moving accounts of how some of these African heads of state would call Israel, expressing regret and stating they wished not to, but regretfully would be announcing the termination of their diplomatic ties with Israel the following day. If you find oil and gas in Israel, then get back to us, right? So from that perspective, the situation is better today because Israel now has some of these resources itself. But again, this accusation that it's somehow an outpost of Western colonialism and so on is simply historical nonsense. That's precisely how it should be formulated. And I haven't even begun to discuss how Israel is, in the end, a nation of refugees, and when considered historically, a state born from liberated slaves, you understand. That is, if you look a little further back in history, none of that seems to matter.
The Arab population is also large, and they're definitely not white, as they come from Arab countries as Jews.
That was the second point I wanted to raise. So this framing of Israel as Schwitten demonstrates, as I stated before, a profound ignorance of Israeli society. At times, more than 70% of the Israeli population were Jews originating from Arab countries, spanning from Morocco and Algeria all the way to Iraq, Yemen, and various other nations in between. And today, it's still over 50% who either originate directly from there or are their descendants. So it's truly absurd to speak of some kind of white settler society.
And 2 million Arabs who are also in Israel.
Right, non-Jewish Arabs.
And are not Jewish. I'd really like to take another break at this point, if that's all right, before we continue, and express my gratitude for this particular segment. In the upcoming section, we shall delve into the left and your intricate connection to it.
My bond.
With this group. Thank you for now.
Mena-Watch, the independent Middle East think tank. Also, be sure to visit our website. There you'll discover new daily reports and in-depth, scientifically grounded background analyses focusing on the MENA region's history and current events.